Well, welcome everybody. The room is filling. We're really glad that everyone's here. We wish we were doing these in person, and we're easing our way into Kavli conversations in person. The next one will be sort of half in person at Caveat, actually, a cool event space in downtown Manhattan. So it's a transition, but we're getting there, and we're very grateful to all of you for sticking with us, and we're especially grateful to our guests, Helen Scales and Ian Urbina, and to Doug Main, who will be moderating. I'm Dan Fagan, and I'm the director of the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting program at NYU, and a professor of journalism at NYU. And I've been an environmental writer for a long time. And one of the great pleasures for me as a professor is to see other people really getting into the environment beat. And Doug Main is certainly one of those people. Doug is a senior writer and editor for National Geographic. He spends a lot of time focusing on animals, including wildlife. He's writes about all kinds of things, including biota in the oceans. He freelances too. His work has been in the New York Times and the Atlantic and the Washington Post and Scientific American. And before he was at National Geographic, Doug was at Newsweek, and before that at Popular Science, and before that at livescience.com. And before that, he was a student at Chirp, and even then, he was really passionate about environmental stories. And like I said, it's been just a real pleasure for me to watch his career unfold in such a terrific way. A couple of just housekeeping notes. We're going to use the Q&A box for questions. So we really want all of you all in the audience to interact with our speakers. But we'll need to do it through the Q&A box, not the chat box. So please, if you click on Q&A on the bottom, that box will pop up, and please use that. And Doug and I will both monitor the Q&A box and find a way to work those questions in. We're here to talk about the oceans and journalism, of course. And we just have the perfect panel, all three of these folks, to steer us through that. But we want you to be part of the conversation too. So with that, I will turn it over to Doug to formally introduce our guests and to get the conversation rolling. And meanwhile, I will turn off my video because no one wants to see me. But I'll still be here, and we'll pop back on as needed. So Doug, take it away.
All right. Great. Thanks for that introduction, Dan. And thank you for inviting me. And thank you all for being here. I'm really excited about this panel. We have two amazing guests with us. The topic, as I'm sure you know, is about the ocean and the crises that are affecting the people and wildlife that live there. I guess I'll just go right into introductions because I'm very excited to speak with these two. First, we have Helen Scales. She is a marine biologist, PhD. She is the author of several best-selling books, the latest being The Brilliant Abyss, right here. The book is about the deep sea, the animals and plants and all the other wildlife that live there, and also the threats facing it. She also contributes to a variety of publications, such as National Geographic, The Guardian, New Scientist, BBC Focus, and appears regularly on BBC Radio. She also teaches marine biology and science writing at Cambridge University. I'm also excited to introduce Ian Urbina. He's an investigative reporter who's won many awards, including the Pulitzer. He was at the New York Times for about 15 years. I think that's right, Ian, from 2003 to 2019. During 5 of those years, I think a total of 3 at sea, which I'm excited to hear more about. He wrote a series of stories about crimes at sea called Outlaw Ocean. That series won many awards, including the George Polk Award, and it became a book, which is right here, Outlaw Ocean. Ian left the Times in 2019 to form the Outlaw Ocean Project, which is a nonprofit devoted to telling stories about crimes at sea. Excellent. So maybe I would like to start. My introduction is one thing, but I would like to hear just from your own voice about how you got to where you are now in your career, and I'm also curious, just kind of a brief summary of how you got to where you are, and I wonder if there's a moment in your life or career, some kind of experience that where you became fascinated with the ocean, or you realized that this was something that you wanted to work on, for devote your life to. Let's start with Helen.
Thanks, Doug. And I just want to start off by saying I really am just so thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me, for all of you coming along, and to be speaking alongside Doug and Ian is a huge pleasure and an honor. So thank you so much for having me. Also, I should point out I'm in the UK. So if at any point I start dropping off, it's not because I'm bored, it's just because it's late. I have coffee, it should be fine, but just in case. So just a word of warning there. But yeah, so I guess I could maybe describe to you a couple of moments in my life, which I think bring me to where I am today, both in terms of the ocean and also writing about the ocean. I did have this aha moment. Scuba diving in the UK, I think I was 16 or 17, and I decided I would learn to dive. I didn't live anywhere near the ocean at that point. Well, not too far. I mean, I live on an island in England. There's not too far to go, but I was in a landlocked county. But I decided that I wanted to scuba dive. Kind of thought it would be quite fun, and I took my first open water dive, and it was March. It was a lake. It was like a flooded gravel pit, the kind of place you'd go training. I remember jumping in the water. I was wearing what they call a semi-dry suit, but there didn't seem to be much dry about mine. It was just very wet and cold, very cold. I'd spent months already training in the pool, in the swimming pool, and this was my first time out of water. I jumped in. This ridiculously cold water started seeping into every corner of my suit. I couldn't see beyond my hand in front of my face, and I did start to wonder what this was all about. But then I got down there. My dive instructor was pretty much holding my hand, so I didn't kind of disappear in the murk. But then basically one little tiny fish, it was nothing special, just a small little silverfish came into my view and hovered in front of me. And I just remember having this extraordinary feeling of the glass in the aquarium had fallen away in front of me, and I was in its three-dimensional world. And if my skills at diving were better, at that point they were pretty poor. It was my first time outdoors, but I figured I could follow after it. That's the thing I couldn't do before. You're watching fish and they're swimming around, in those glass boxes, but I was in this endless glass box really, and I just had this feeling I wanted to follow it and learn more about it, and basically spend as much time as I could underwater. It was the physical sensation combined with that that particular encounter with this animal that I'd never seen in its own environment before. So having been a very kind of nature, kind of green, outdoorsy kind of kid, suddenly my vision went to kind of blue from maybe green, and the oceans were kind of for me, and I got myself in salt water, and everything from there basically got better from that very cold encounter in that lake. And it was sort of went on from there. I did a lot of studying in marine science. I did a master's, a PhD. And it was actually then the second moment I want to tell you about is during my PhD, which was I went into it with this very clear view that I was going to become a marine conservationist, a kind of academic who would go and save the oceans, basically. That's what I was going to do. Probably working for an NGO somewhere, heading up WWF. That's how I saw myself coming out of my PhD, or somewhere down the line. But then basically I just completely unexpectedly found this love and interest, and I guess power, in communicating and in writing and in talking about the oceans. And this was something I honestly had no clue about before I started the PhD. I wrote because I had to, pass exams and write papers, that kind of thing. But it had never occurred to me that this would be something that A, I would enjoy, B, that I was okay at and I could get better at, and that C would be this powerful tool to communicate. And And I was very fortunate because at that point, being kind of just a partway into my PhD program, I had a whole bunch of opportunities to try out science writing and science radio. I got trained up in the student radio station, and I had a go at that. So I basically had a go at kind of trying these things out in a really safe environment. It didn't really matter what I wrote for the student newspaper. It was just kind of trying things out. But I found I really liked it and that I could get better at it. So by the time I finished my PhD, I had this idea of a slightly different path to the one I had going into it. I carried along on that same route for quite a while. I worked for NGOs as I came out. I did some other projects around the world, as a scientist working in the field. But at the same time, I had this kind of writing plan going. I started freelancing kind of on the side, started writing for National Geographic website, for their news website, and had this idea for a book kind of ticking over. And it took a couple of years to get that first book off the ground. I was very lucky to get an agent not too long out of my PhD, and they helped me to get my first deal, which was a book about seahorses. I very clearly remember meeting an agent and they said, so, okay, what do you want to write about? Don't write about your PhD. And I was like, okay, not that. And I didn't do a PhD on seahorses, but I thought they were lovely creatures, so I would do that. And I guess the rest kind of built up from there. Of me just taking a book at a time, a job at a time. Eventually I went full time, more and more towards the writing and the communicating. Managed to get myself lots of more and more work at the BBC to make radio programs and documentaries with them. And so for me, it's really built up to me to be a sort of, I guess you'd call it portfolio career. I do mix things together. I've now managed to sort of keep a foot in the science world as well as the writing and the documentary world. And I really love that. I love having that mix of things to do. It means that, every month, every year, every week, I'm doing something a bit different. Sometimes I'm doing too many things at once. But I do love it. And I think this is where it wasn't where I was expecting to be. At this point, it wasn't what I was thinking I was going to be doing, perhaps, through my 20s. But in my 30s, it really kind of cemented that sort of path for me, and it seemed to be working, and it still is. So I'm very pleased about that. So that's quite a long story into where I am now, but hopefully that gives you a flavor of a slightly unplanned but sort of serendipitous discovery of where I am now, and who knows where it might go next.
That's great. How about you, Ian?
So I think actually my interest began above the waterline. I was doing doctoral work in an anthropology program, cultural anthropology, and sort of ran away from my dissertation, took some time off, and went to work on a ship in Singapore that never left port. And so for 3 months, we sat there and, as a cultural anthropologist does, I sort of wandered around and got interested in the people and sort of the diaspora, transient tribe of seafarers that roam the globe just kind of captured my imagination. And so then, after about 3-4 months, I went back to grad school and, ended up at the New York Times and always harbored this real curiosity about that frontier and quite especially the people that work out there and as well the marine life and sort of the experience of traversing it, but most especially the people.
That's interesting that the first experience was with people on a ship that couldn't go to sea. It's almost, I don't know, there's something poetic about that. So I'm curious, how long did it take to get back out to actually get to sea? I mean, can you describe how your reporting obviously has been investigative, focused on a lot of misdeeds, scandals, etc. How did that lead you back to the ocean, and when did you first really get involved and have the idea for the Outlaw Ocean series?
I mean, so I was an investigative reporter, and to some degree the mandate of that branch of journalism is, as at least as I define or understand it, is you're really hunting for things that are broken to shine light on them so that they might be fixed. So, I had finished up a series and my editor asked me what I wanted to do next, and I wasn't ready for the conversation, frankly. And I had harbored this notion of, wouldn't it be amazing if I could get the Gray Lady, the New York Times, to pay to send me to sea? I know for a fact, from 15 years ago, that there's pretty incredible things happening out there, and quite especially at the intersection of human rights, labor, and environment. And I was a bit frustrated with, in my view, how stories that come out of the space tend to focus exclusively on the environmental issue at the and not as much on sort of the intersectionality of it. And so I thought, well, it would be great fun, and I know there's really great stories and not a whole lot of competition. And also I won't run into the jurisdictional issues of parachuting into other people's beats in their backyards, because at the New York Times there is not a reporter who owns that territory. So for a lot of reasons, it just seemed like a really good fit. And again, one of the goals that we had at the outset was, if you say, maritime crime or bad stuff that happens at sea, most people would say BP spill or plastic pollution or, Somali piracy, all legitimate, concerns, and overfishing to some degree. But I wanted to look at, intentional dumping of oil, not spilling of it, or sea slavery, or murder of stowaways, or arms trafficking, or illegal whaling, or myriad other things that would broaden the taxonomy of what people understood to be happening out there that might be of concern.
That makes sense. And then, so I assume it started small. And then when did you genuinely want to do this as a series? Was there a certain point you kind of got hooked, and was there a book in mind at that point, or?
No. So this meeting was sprung on me, and I had floated this crazy idea before and had always gotten this kind of, quizzical, skeptical look from editors, like, that sounds impossibly slow and costly and maybe dangerous. And this editor, she had been an editor at the Baltimore Sun. She's kind of a famous editor at the Times, at least, named Rebecca Corbett, and she was David Simon's editor at the Baltimore Sun, who wrote The Wire, and she oversaw a series of the Sun about shipbreaking that won a Pulitzer. So she actually already had real familiarity with the crazy stuff that happens in the maritime and distant water fishing fleets. So I was sort of pushing on a semi-open door, and I pitched her on the thought of, look, I really know that there's really intense stuff happening out there, and I think it'd be an amazing series if you trusted me to go after it. And so she said, write a memo. So I wrote a memo with 10 proposed stories, and then we took it to the Dean Baquet, the executive editor, and he whittled it down to 5 that really interested him. And then they said, why don't we start with these 3 and see how that goes? And off I went, chasing these stories. So it was going to be a 3-part series, and we ran 3 stories after about 4 or 5 months of reporting. And then there was a really strong positive reaction to it. So Dean said, send them back out. So we did 3 more stories and a magazine piece. And then at the end of that, I thought, then book publishers and other sorts approached me. And I also just had become captive, like Helen's describing, it's an enchanting place for all its problems and its marvel and beauty. It really does capture you, and in some unhealthy ways, too, at least for me, spending more and more time out there, it became harder to adjust to life on land. But anyway, it captured me, and I thought, yeah, I'm going to take 2 years off and go write a book on this. So that's what I did.
Excellent. So there are a lot of issues facing the ocean, and you mentioned some of them, Ian. I guess maybe to start, because I do want to cover some of them one by one. I don't want this just to be craft talk, just because the issues are so fascinating and important. I guess maybe to kick it back to Helen, the question is, so what are the most important issues facing the ocean? And what do people need to know that they don't? Do you think that ocean...
I just lost you there for a second. I don't know if that's my audio. Can you still hear me?
I lost you as well, Doug.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, it's not just you.
I'm
Doug.
so sorry. Can you hear me now?
We got
You
you.
came back.
You're
It's
back.
fine.
You're back.
Yeah.
I'm sorry about that.
No,
Where
no,
did
it's
you
fine.
lose me?
No, you'd finished your question. I think you were asking me
Okay, don't know how that happened. Sorry.
what would you like people to know that they don't know about the ocean as well, right?
Right, and also, what are the most important problems
Okay.
facing?
Yeah. So I guess I'll stick with with my beat, which is life in the oceans mostly, and then I'm
Sure.
sure Ian can speak to more kind of directly to the human issues. Obviously, there's a huge amount of overlap, but I mean, obviously, I mean the biggest issues in the ocean are all interconnected in all sorts of complex ways, which I think is one reason why this is a fascinating but also challenging topic to write about. I mean, obviously, there's climate change, and that intersects with, I mean, let's call it overexploitation as a general term, but mostly that's overfishing, and a lot of that is forms of fishing which is causing significant physical damage to physical habitats, I guess, as well. So bottom trawling, trawling of deep seamounts, that kind of thing. So you're not only looking at the exploitation of vulnerable populations, but also kind of collateral damage in the process. And again, that has ties into climate change. There was a paper out not too long ago talking about just kind of trying to get a handle on what might the climate impacts of, say, bottom trawling be by the disruption of carbon stores in the seabed. And those various big numbers thrown around. Obviously, it's all models and various estimates are made, but maybe something equivalent to the aviation industry. And then I guess there's pollution, and that's another sort of big overarching term. Climate change is a form of pollution. We have the issue in the oceans of the fact that this is the endpoint for a lot of the carbon that humanity is releasing, and that in itself is having other issues aside from just rising temperatures, but also we have acidification, and how the oceans are kind of just an enormously integral part of the ocean. The atmospheric ocean climate system is kind of driving our climate. It's absorbing carbon, releasing carbon, it's moving heat around the planet. It's this sort of key part, absolutely key part of life on Earth. So I see those as the kind of the three big ones, I guess, sort of climate change / pollution, I suppose, one to two of those, and then overexploitation. What do people need to know? Well, I guess there's good and bad on this too. You need to know that the oceans have an extraordinary capacity to recover. Ocean life has an extraordinary capacity to recover and to regenerate on its own, given a chance. A lot of the solutions we have for these sorts of problems in the ocean are not rocket science. We know how well, in many circumstances, leaving areas of the ocean alone from development and from fishing is a great way of helping the ocean heal itself, and that happens. So there's that. And then, I mean, there's all sorts of ways we could take this, but I guess one thing is, I think is kind of important to know as well, is that there isn't actually anywhere away. No, maybe that's not true. Maybe Ian's going to come back on that. But like this idea that it's beyond the horizon and we can't see it, I think that's becoming less and less true. How on earth do we manage fisheries? And yeah, it's a huge challenge to that. But I think that's one of the key things that's changing at the moment in terms of how we're dealing with the ocean, is that there is a kind of hopefully a growing sense that we have got eyes in more parts of the ocean than we ever have before. I think I'm digging myself into a hole here with Ian. Perhaps I'll just be quiet at this point.
I agree with the point.
I was going to say, how would you answer that question any differently, Ian, or anything you would add? I mean, obviously there's the human element, but I mean, they're inextricably linked, but is there anything you'd add?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Helen, everything you said I agree with. I think to sort of thread the needle between your point about common sense policy and the true actually existing capability of better protecting this space, 100% agree. I think what the step further I would take in my direction is that there's a woeful lack of will. So it's not that we can't do it, but we don't. And so I think that moves me towards a meta notion, which is, if there was one thought that I have about the space, is that it's distinct. There's a distinct lack of governance out there, and under that umbrella, you have lots of things. Whether you're going to look at, murder with impunity, or whether you're going to look at bottom trawling or seabed mining, or whatever you choose to look at, overfishing, to me, they all fit under a worrisome lack of governance. And that lack might not be because they can't govern, or there isn't technology that allows them to govern, or that there couldn't be better policing or any policing or accountability. It's that there isn't, and that's a bunch of reasons. The victims are typically voiceless, whether they're, fish or trafficked Indonesians, or the workplace is transient. It's in a public domain that is jurisdictionally complicated. There are very few cops out there. I mean, there are a lot of reasons, but it can be governed. It isn't, in my view.
That makes sense. As a place, that most people don't know much about or won't see much of, and if we're talking about the deep sea, almost no one will ever see in person. I mean, a very, very small amount of people will, but most people won't. Are there any unique challenges in writing about the ocean or communicating about the ocean because it's so remote? Like, how do you address that sort of challenge in your mind, as a place that is sort of out of sight, out of mind?
What do you want?
Do you want me to start on that one?
Sure, Helen, please.
Sure. So yeah, the out of sight, out of mind thing is just given for. I've just told you that we have nowhere out of sight in the ocean. But I absolutely, Ian, you kind of nailed that point about it's a decision. It's the capability potentially is there for us to be seeing what's going on. We just aren't. We aren't doing what these sort of fairly obvious solutions we could be taking. That's a whole governance issue. But yeah, the ocean is, we don't live there pretty much. Well, most people don't. Ian, you have lived there for a long time, and many people get stuck there, but or work there. I mean, so the deep ocean is sort of the extreme version of that. And as I was setting out to write the Brilliant Abyss, I kind of had myself as a writer on this topic. I was sort of, I felt myself kind of torn between two possibilities. One, which was to do whatever I could to get myself there and find some way of getting myself a rare seat in one of these subs that does go down and explores the greater depths where there's no sunlight and beyond, or do what everybody else does and don't go into the deep sea, because not many people get to do that, just like not many people get to go into space. And I kind of decided to go on that second route, partly just because I felt like that is our experience of the deep ocean. It's the experience of most people of the entire ocean, even the edges and the surface seas are places that, relatively small portion of the human population gets to actually, do that, especially, out beyond the horizon. So it became for me this game of, well, how do we know what's down there? And a lot of that is just because we have extraordinary technologies, remote technologies these days to hook up in real time, to these expeditions that are going out there. I did get to go on a deep sea expedition for the book specifically, but we weren't diving. We were sending remote operated vehicles. So my experience of it was on a ship. And actually, I felt more restricted in my access to the ocean than I normally would if I was going on a shallow water expedition, because I wasn't even allowed to go swimming. Like, that was against the rules on this particular vessel. Was, we were in the Gulf of Mexico. The water was beautiful and warm and blue, and we just would love to have jumped in, but we weren't allowed to. It was all it was just sending the machines down there. But that's the experience of, the vast majority of deep sea scientists don't get to go down there. So I wanted to experience more of that reality of what, how do you explore someplace you don't actually get to go. But Doug, I mean, you touched on this question of, how do you write about a place that most people don't get to go? And I think, I mean, in so many ways for me, there are these parallels between the deep ocean and space. I mean, some of them are just obvious things like, people don't get to go there, but equally, we use similar technologies. We send robots into space, we send them down into the deep ocean. That's how we know, and how, we're sending probes, we're figuring it out that way. And yet, I mean, I don't know, I haven't done a survey of this, but I kind of get the sense that there is just something that grasps people, that there is just more of this excitement about space than there is about the deep ocean. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe if we did go and, you know, ask people around the world, which do you get more excited about, giant squid or the possibility of giant squid on another planet? But there is just this kind of difference between it. And I don't quite know what we do. And I think that's one of the challenges, is figuring out how to make, you know, the inner space of this planet as exciting as the idea of heading off into outer space. You know, given that so much of the sort of same technologies are being used, a few people get to go and come back and tell us stories about what it was like, but there just isn't quite yet, I think, that same feeling of excitement, and I think there should be, because we are obviously finding out extraordinary things about the deep ocean more and more all the time. We're not running out of extraordinary discoveries, and it's right here on Earth, so we should be, you know, I think we just, I don't know if it's a branding issue. I don't know what we do to make that really kind of grasp people's imagination as much as space exploration does. But we'll keep working at it, I guess.
Ian, do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, if the question is, you know, what are the challenges and opportunities of writing about this space? I think the opportunities, and Helen is among the best doing it, you know, are that you get to describe another world, you know, and I personally think that above the waterline, sort of in far off in the high seas, is equally, you know, fertilizing material for imagination, and as the deep sea. So for me, I think that as a writer trying to render the experience of being at sea, above or below the waterline, one has to think more of the five senses, and more of really trying to, again, anthropologically render as if you're a radio broadcaster from Saturn. You know, like, you really have to think about what Earth folk are not going to get about this space. The weather comes from above and below. You know, the light is completely different. The laws of physics are different. Your internal biology changes if you're at sea long enough. The social dynamics on a ship are fundamentally different. The hierarchy of authority, the rules of communication, the consequences of deviation from law, you know, like, these things are really different than on land. And so I think really pondering all that stuff and finding a way to render it to readers that's interesting is a great opportunity, but it's also a huge challenge.
Hey, Doug, can I add something to that? I think it's a really interesting, you know, question. Why aren't people as excited about the ocean than they are about space? And I think it has something to do with literature and familiarity, right? Because the oceans, you know, during the Age of Discovery, the so-called Age of Discovery, there was all kinds of literature and fiction focused on fiction and nonfiction, but adventuring on the oceans, at least on the ocean's surface. And then once the era of space exploration began, you know, there was an explosion of science fiction about space, and fiction writing about the ocean really stepped back. And I don't know what can be done about that. You know, I mean, both of you all, each in your own way, have, you know, are writing, you know, truly compelling nonfiction about this wild place that covers whatever 70% of the planet or whatever it is. I guess it's more than that. But somehow there's a kind of a familiarity to, or rather there's an unfamiliarity to space that oceans don't have. And I don't know how to capture that. I don't know whether you guys have specific sort of tips, you know, for sort of how to make the ocean feel like what it is, which is still a vast undiscovered space. Either undiscovered or, as Ian has pointed out, lawless, you know, and there's tremendous potential, you know, drama in the lawlessness of the place. in addition to being just truly horrible from a point of view of human rights and biodiversity and all the things that we care about. So all the narrative elements are there, I guess is what I'm saying. I don't know, any you guys have thoughts on that? Or maybe Doug does, I don't know.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I think that maybe don't compare the two. Like, so, like, imagine we're talking, the four of us are reporters, and we're trying to scheme on how to get our editor to invest in more of this reporting. First, I would say, okay, let's lose the comparison to outer space and let's compare it to on land, and let's argue, hey, like, we have 7 bureaus in Africa, but there are 50 million people that work at sea. That's more than, shouldn't we have maybe 1 or 5 reporters by ratio, or 2/3 of the planet, if we do it by geography and not by population? I think there are a whole lot of other ways to argue the case that this space is not just interesting, which I think we can do, and Helen does, and read her book, but also, like, it's super, super urgent for our very survival, from a food security, from a geopolitical point of view, from all these ways. So I think that's the angle in to convince the public or editors that we should be doubling down on this reporting. Elon Musk can throw money at outer space, and that's great, but, like, let's just keep putting out stories about this place on the planet that's, like you said, 2/3 of its surface. That would be my angle.
I think that's a great angle. And I guess I would just add, I mean, you said, yeah, we've got that these sort of extraordinary discoveries going on in terms of the life of the ocean, and I'm finding that that's some of the feedback I'm getting from The Brilliant Abyss, from the Deep Sea book, is kind of interesting, from people who aren't kind of already, ocean nuts, because they're reading it. But it's like the people who weren't, like, oh yeah, people who are kind of more sort of, okay, what's this about? And a lot of them have said to me how shocked they are, not just about the second half of the book where I talk about the problems of the ocean, but in the first half and just the sort of the things that happen down there. And so I guess that's kind of fun too, that it offers up just these really very different views of life on Earth. You're genuinely transformational views of what life can be. And that in itself, I think a lot of people seem to be grasping onto that, which is kind of nice. Like, I had no idea that, there are these crazy worms that eat whale bones, and where are they when they're not on a whale, and that kind of, it really gets people thinking about how life evolved and what the possibilities are. So yeah, it's a brilliant sort of biology lesson down there. So it's just all there for the taking, really.
I think also that, a lot of this research is pretty new on the deep sea, especially relatively speaking. I mean, before the 70s and 80s, we didn't even know about that there was life, that chemosynthetic life powered by deep sea vents. And we didn't really know much about that there even were deep sea vents, and we didn't know, and we're still finding creatures that live there. So I think coverage of the animals that we keep finding is just a good way to get people interested. But I think, I often, maybe this is an aside, but I often wonder why people don't care more about life on this planet. And, people walk around looking at trees and they don't even know, like, this is going to sound judgmental, but, like, foliage blindness is a thing. Like, people don't even know an oak versus a ginkgo versus like an ant or a bee. Do people know there are like 20,000 species of bees, which is as many species of fish there are in the world? So yeah, that's something I think about and frankly, like, try and fight against on a daily basis, to be honest. Ian, you said something I wanted to follow up on. You mentioned it helps to point out the differences between things going on at sea and at land. That's like kind of a useful way of thinking about it. In your book, you talk about a lot of just terrible abuses by companies, individuals, but that just would not be tolerated at land, or at least it's almost unimaginable that it would be. Sea slavery, abuse, all kinds of really grisly stuff. I guess I just wanted to ask you a little bit more about in reporting. There's so many things to focus on, but I guess you were mentioning that in the context of both illegal fishing, but also just all the human rights abuses, I think especially in the South China Sea. my question is, I think part of the reason that that hasn't got more coverage is that it's difficult to get out there, and you're dealing with either illegality and abuse and things that are just by their nature hard to cover. Can you talk about how you approached that, how you got out there, and just some of the challenges you faced in that process?
Yeah, so I mean, I think you're honing in on the sea slavery reporting. So that specific answer differs, say, than other reporting. The bulk of the book sea slavery reporting was focused on the South China Sea, and quite especially the Thai fleet. And the most egregious conditions tends to be on a certain subsection of most fleets: the Chinese fleet, the Taiwanese, South Korean, Thai, especially the distant water fleet and the transshipment distant water fleet. So these are the boats that stay out at sea for very long times, don't come back to port, but they offload their catch to motherships that bring them back to port. That subsection of ships sometimes will stay out for 2 straight years, sometimes a year, and those were notorious. So we wanted to get, the photographer and I wanted to get on those if we could, but they're especially hard because they're so far away. And yeah, so how we did it, we went to a specific place in Thailand called Songkhla, which is a place where a lot of the distant water fleet was based, and a lot of the sort of most mafia kind of families that run those fleets tended to be based in Songkhla or Kantang. And then we sort of just, we thought that we might be able to find a captain willing to take us all the way out and talk our way onto a target vessel where we could just chronicle the conditions on one of these vessels. That was a non-starter, and 4 or 5 weeks in of trying, we realized we'd have to hopscotch. So we would at best be able to find a captain who would take us 50 miles out, 100 miles out, and then talk our way onto another vessel on the condition that he would take us even further out, talk us onto another. And so that's ultimately what we did. Yeah, the vessel that we arrived to, that was sort of the quintessential sea slavery vessel, was what's called a forage fish or trash fish vessel. This is a fish that's was targeting fish meal and fish that is not largely isn't for human consumption. 40 Cambodian crew, 5 Thai officers, all trafficked crew, some as young as 13. Yeah, I mean, we got lucky after a lot of trying, 5-6 weeks of trying, and landed a really compelling vessel to visit and spend time on in detail.
When you're talking to people who are in desperate circumstances, either people involved in the people who are actually kind of stuck at sea, or the captains, the people that are more culpable. I was really interested by something you said in the book about the importance of silence, and I guess, I mean, one question I'm trying to ask is, how do you get people to talk to you in such trying circumstances, especially when they are desperate and or one would think they wouldn't want to talk about things that make them look bad. How do you get people to talk to you?
I mean, obviously it varies, if we're talking to a captain that's been accused of murdering someone, that's one thing. If we're talking to, someone that just engaged in intentional dumping of oil, that's another thing. But in the case of the sea slavery, well, the common denominator across all of them is, number one, you have to have the luxury of time, and that was a luxury that I was granted by the New York Times, and then I took ownership over when I became my own boss. But you really need to have the luxury of time where you can slow things down, so that you can leverage silence and leverage sort of pacing of a relationship. In the distant water fishing fleet, but fishing in general, maritime overall, seafaring, the bar is even higher. I've done coal mining and truck driving and sex work and garment in Bangladesh, and nowhere did I find the barriers to access harder anthropologically than seafarers, because there's just this sort of gruff wall. So you just have to sit and spend a lot more time not asking anything, just being present. Sometimes that will last days. Point one. Point two, I think you have to be kind of nakedly, embarrassingly honest about your interests and your preparation or your lack thereof. With preparation, I think you really do need to have done your homework. And if you're approaching, let's say, the captains on these, Thai vessels, some of whom engage unapologetically in demonstrative violence, even murder, you really kind of have to have done your homework to try to wrap your head around, from their view, why that is important. Like what purpose is that serving? And if you go in there without even the least effort to try to get some fluency in their perspective, you're probably going to get nowhere in terms of getting them to talk with you. And so that is a hard lesson I learned over the years of doing this, but really trying to almost, and a lot of times these folks you're talking to can't, not because they're not smart, but just because they're not in the habit of having to explain themselves. So like you actually have to say, okay, I've talked about 5, 6 different captains about the use of violence on the vessels. And what I'm hearing is that it's a scary thing to be a captain when you're 4 of you and there are 40 of them and you're 45 and they're 22 and you're at sea and there's a real chance of mutiny and they will crush you. So I'm thinking that maybe the demonstrative violence, though I don't agree with it, is possibly a result of that. Obviously, you don't say it so nerdy, but like this is what you roll out a little bit slower and attempt to sort of show them that you're willing to try to sort of get in their skin a bit, and maybe even better at it than they will be. That wins you a lot of credibility in these settings. So, waiting, silence, and kind of showing your math, showing your work, to me are things that help a lot.
There's a scene in the book where you're talking to, I believe you pronounce his name Long. Is that how you say it?
Lang Long.
Lang Long, yeah. And I'm just going to read a tiny bit from it because I was almost mesmerized by this. You write in the book, you're telling your translator what you're about to do. You're warning your translator of some of my antics. I will likely sit for 15 to 20 minutes in silence at the outset after you introduce me to Long, I told him. I will want you to simply and concisely tell him who I am and what my goal is to capture the story of what happened to him. Then I will shake his hand. Then we will sit in silence. I'm jumping around a bit. It will be awkward, I warned, but please let the quiet do its work. And then you talk about how you put down chewing gum and you drink water. But it sounds like you sat in silence for half an hour before talking. And I was just intrigued by that because I mean, how did you learn? I mean, how did you learn the importance of silence and that technique specifically? Does it have to do something specifically with how the differences and the uniqueness of life at sea, or was it partially because this man was obviously traumatized and you were trying to win his trust? Can you just talk through that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I didn't know what. I'm still learning how to do this thing, and I'm 49. I've been doing it for 25, 30 years. And so I'm picking up things just as you, and I'm sure Helen does. I do think that my grad school work in anthropology helped a lot in, I spent time in the field, and kind of one of the earliest things I was told to do was shut up. Like just go there and sit and don't even have a notebook out. Don't put a recorder on the table. Just shut up and sit and just watch and be present. And that really carried over into journalism. And then, like journalists, and again, Helen, you're an academic journalist, so you're of a higher species. So I'm not besmirching you, but journalists, we are a manipulative sort, and we are trying to get information from people. And so you learn psyops, psychological tactics to try to get people to relax, to apply pressure. And the silence thing was as much respect for the trauma. This is a guy who had been shackled by the neck for 1.5 years as he was sold boat to boat. I mean, horrific things happened to him. So it was sort of respect. It was also sort of meant to make him feel awkward and want to hurry up and start talking, damn it. Like, so that he would want to get this interview going, because what are we doing here? Like, and so, and sometimes that doesn't work, but often it does. So yeah, I think I learned it just by trial and error.
Got it. That's fascinating. A question for Helen. As a former academic, I still a former and current academic. I didn't mean to besmirch you there. I just mean, coming into this world from research and getting a PhD. Was it ever challenging, or has it been challenging to go from between those worlds? And I mean, how did you adjust to just the very different type of communication and writing that is necessary for peer-reviewed research, let's say, in a journal, versus writing a book or writing for Nat Geo or what have you?
It's a really good question, actually, and especially now that I do a fair amount of teaching of science writing. A lot of people I speak to are academics who want to communicate their science better. So, we go through what I went through. Although I kind of feel like I was pretty lucky in what I did was I really just taught myself. I feel like I taught myself, which is not quite true. I taught myself, and I put myself in positions where I got others to help me kind of surreptitiously to write better, and I sort of just had a sort of soft launch, I guess, during the PhD days when I was doing two things, I guess. And one of the interesting things I found was that actually I even just writing my thesis, like parts of that kind of was sort of already leaning towards the kind of writing I do now, like not the kind of meat and bones sort of data chapters, but the introduction and the discussion. I remember very clearly getting to that point. I had to write a great big long kind of 90,000 word thesis, and I did the main sections in the middle, which was all the stuff I'd done, all the research I'd been doing, and what I'd found out, and then I had to kind of top and tail it with this intro and discussion. And for a few days I sat there scratching my head, not really knowing what to do, and then I spoke to my advisors, and they just said, write what you want, just set the scene and then talk about it at the end, and lean us on to whatever might happen next. And so suddenly it became this storytelling exercise, which I didn't really kind of realize was allowed at that point. And it wasn't full on kind of science communication because it was still for an academic audience, but I just suddenly felt, I think already I got this sense of like letting go a bit of that sort of the strict rigors of academic writing. And as I've gone along, and as I tried more and more doing other types of writing, I have found it harder and harder to go back to the academic style of writing, which frankly appalls me at times now that I've sort of come quite a bit further away from it. And a lot of it is in my daily life. I read a lot of papers. I speak to a lot of scientists, and there's such a wide range of the kind of writing that you get in journals. So yeah, I guess I haven't found it. I've just kind of taken that challenge on myself as I went along, to the point where it's obviously something I'm going to keep working on. As Ian sort of hinted, there's no end point to this or any of this. We're constantly pushing to do better and to do different things, and to figure out what works and what doesn't. And that's a huge challenge, but also quite a joy of what we do. I think I enjoy that kind of progression of it, and it's one of the things I teach my students is the good news is if you're terrible, you can get better at this, and I do get lots of people who find it really hard, really very hard to let go of that academic style of writing. I think I was one of the sort of people who probably wasn't ever quite suited for that way of thinking, so I was quite happy going this way, and taking those connections between the two, but really happy to kind of go down the more storytelling route. And I think as that story I told about my PhD was like a hint at that. It was like, this is the bit you're good at, the end and the beginning. That middle bit, yeah, you were fine, but I think this is where you belong. So maybe that was partly what was subconsciously happening to me as I was kind of figuring stuff out post grad school, was, well, actually, this is what I enjoy doing much more. And I still absolutely love telling stories. And maybe, Dan, I will write a book one day, and a novel, I should say, and get people to love the oceans as much as space. That's a challenge for me to take.
I always think that the key distinction between academic writing and journalism for broad audiences just having a sort of empathy for your audience, having a keen sense of what the audience is really looking for. Speaking of audiences, there's some good questions. I feel like maybe we should take some. Doug, is it okay with you if we do that? I don't know whether you can see them, Doug. If you can't, in the Q&A, I can ask a few of them.
Sure, I can see one of them. I like the second one there.
Yeah, and the third one's good too. So yeah.
Or sure. First, yeah. So let's start with this. Question from Abe Musselman. Are you supposed to say who asked it? Anyway, I just did.
Sure.
Ocean issues.
Yeah. By the way, Abe is sorry to interrupt, Doug, but Abe is a current church student who came up with this idea for this event today. So thank you.
Oh, nice. What's up, Abe? Abe asks, ocean issues seem so global, and when reporting about the ocean, it's easy to get lost in the big picture. Do you have any tips for journalists for starting small and presumably local and going from there? We start with Ian.
There are these questions that the question answers itself because they're so well crafted, and it leaves the answer little. I think that question answers itself. Like, I think that starting small, I personally think you should always try to do both. And you shouldn't let yourself off with everything's local and leave it at that. I think you really need to try to press yourself to connect it to bigger issues in some fashion. But I think, yeah, finding a local peg to it, a human peg, a geographically, connected peg is essential. I don't think that answers your question. So sorry. Maybe Helen.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Helen?
I think that kind of does answer the question. Yeah, I would say, well, I guess like anything, it's finding those stories that no one else has got yet. And if you're lucky enough to live near an ocean or near a coast, then start there. Or if you're traveling or you want to go someplace, or there's someplace you want to visit, you're seeking out those little pieces of the story that no one else has yet picked up on. And as Ian quite rightly points out, it has that hook of a human story, a geographic story of something different. But at the same time, I mean, so many stories about the ocean, yeah, they're global, but they start somewhere. They start at a factory sending pollution out. They start on a ship. They start with one particular story that then kind of weaves out, and then maybe you come back to it at the end. So, I mean, I constantly make the mistake of deciding I'm going to write books about ridiculously big topics and completely panic about it. And then realize again and again and keep kind of coming back to this idea that I'm not telling I can't tell the entire story of the deep ocean. That's not really the plan, but it's to find my way through that story, through my own smaller stories that fit together into the picture that I want to tell of this. And so much of it's about those interconnections of smaller relatable stories that weave together, and hopefully by the end of it you've created this kind of convincing version of this place or this issue that you want to talk about. But you're never going to actually do the whole thing, obviously.
So sometimes there's this feeling that you start with the local stuff, and that's where the young people, the early career people, the amateurs, or the young professionals do, and then you graduate to the big global stories. But actually, I don't think that's right at all. And that the hardest work of reporting is not from 50,000 feet. I guess that analogy doesn't work for the ocean, but it's right up close. That's where the really hard work is. But Ian's point is totally right too, that when you're doing those really hard up close stories, you have to also let readers, viewers, listeners understand what the big picture is. And there's no reason that you can't do both. You must do both. And so this sort of feeling that, start small, and then once you're really big and famous, that's when you write the big global stories. I think that's wrong. And that from the start all the way till the end of your career, you should be telling up close stories, but also giving big picture context. And that's what all three, Doug, Helen, and Ian do in their work. And it's what you should do to be successful.
Or just add one thing. I mean, I think thinking about first taking the word starting small and trying to unpack that and say, okay, by starting small, the aspiration should be small can be defined as a single incident, a single person, a single ship, a single small location, a single voyage. Just start granular and located and specific, and then also know the big backdrop you want to get to, and then build in both directions towards each other. But always forcing yourself to figure out what's the granular, and don't get hung up also, now where I'm in the preachy tone, but it doesn't have to be local. It doesn't have to be your local. It could be someone else's local. It should just be granular and located and textured, lived. If you can force whatever it is, plastic pollution. Okay, let's start with one guy and one bottle and one, like some meta issue, climate change. But figure out what little location is, your synecdoche, and then you can head out towards your big grand arrival.
And we can learn from fiction, from movies, from great novels. All stories are up close, but all stories mean something. They stand for something big. So we're constantly turning the aperture of our lens, making it tight, but then we're broadening it out, tight, broad, and that's what you need to do.
I think it also, just to add to that, I think it also goes the other way. I mean, in one view, all stories are local. I mean, all stories, at least they begin up close in a particular place. But I think sometimes the big picture helps you select what small picture you want to start with, right? So if you want to write a story about some issue, climate change, you find a place where it's being particularly affected by this big picture, and there's a reason to write about this one certain place. But also, I think sometimes, at least maybe this is just me in my experience, but sometimes I think we want stories to be bigger. Stories, if it's fascinating and it's gripping and it's important, I think that's enough. That's enough reason, even if it's because it's always gonna have bigger. There are always gonna be bigger issues at play, and sometimes I think we worry too much about the bigger picture. Sometimes, because if a story is fascinating, worth telling, it's worth telling. Maybe I'm just that's just coming from like a frustrated freelancer's point of view. Although I don't really freelance much anymore. But anyway, that's great. There's another question.
Can I throw in one more point about that? I'll be super fast. I do think, as a newspaper person, it's also to bear in mind that not all stories have to be magazine narrative stories. Like, you can have incredible stories. Look at the Pandora papers. Like, these are not like located one guy, an anecdote, a narrative arc. They're like big reveals. Like, what's happening here? I'm going to tell you in this amazing piece an explanation of a big question. There's no narrative there. It's just a reveal, and it's amazing journalism. So I think I sometimes worry that there's a lot of pressure to make everything narrative, and there are amazing stories that are not narrative. They're something else, and that's okay. But just having good editors and colleagues that can help you see which is important.
For sure. I could ask one more question here from Candace Newman. This is a question for Ian. She writes, after reading your book, I wondered whether it would have been possible to investigate the stories as in depth as you did if you were a woman. Basically, I'd be interested in hearing whether you think your stories could have been investigated by women, or whether there would have been challenges around access and other issues. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And unfortunately, I think the answer is no. I think there are huge liberties that, as a male, especially in the seafaring realm, which is just unusually overwhelmingly male, that I was afforded by being a male. And there are multiple examples in my own experience where we almost lost stories because I had a female translator, and we were almost not allowed, on board, because there are federal laws. Like in Indonesia, we almost were not allowed to board the ship because the government said this is a Navy ship and there are no women allowed. So there are big challenges that females face. This goes without saying. I mean, this is obvious, but especially in journalism, especially in this type of journalism, and especially in journalism of this realm. At the same time, there are some isolated instances which I witnessed and found fascinating, where females had distinct access and capabilities and skills uh, in managing certain situations with deckhands. We had a female translator with us on the sea slavery reporting, and again, getting a bunch of these deckhands to open up. She was, I mean, partially just because she was super skilled and she was a translator and she had the cultural fluency, and she was just a smart operator in handling people. She had great emotional intelligence, but also the fact that she was a female and an attractive female was helpful, very helpful to her, and very quickly became clear that Adam, the photographer, and I needed to pull back and get away from her and let her do her thing, because these guys would talk to her and relax around her in a way, and they were interested in her in a way that they were not interested in us. So there are rare exceptions, but generally speaking, no, I don't think. And it's why, some of the females that are doing, this kind of reporting, including the AP women who won a Pulitzer for the sea slavery reporting, are distinctly impressive, because they're accomplishing this level of reporting in this kind of space, being female.
Doug, would you mind if I ask everybody a question?
Sure.
And while I'm at it, I just want to say we've got maybe 15 more minutes, and so feel free to keep those questions coming. Use the Q&A box, and we'll get to them. I guess this is maybe a little bit more of a question for Ian, but I think it applies to Helen too, and that is that you have each sort of in your own way created something unique. I mean, Ian has literally done that. He left, the most powerful media institution in the world, and just left and started a nonprofit that's doing all kinds of interesting things that I hope he'll tell us briefly about. And Helen, you did something that academics do, but not many as successfully as you've done, and that is that you've sort of created a life for yourself as a communicator from an academic perch. And you're really, I don't know if you'd agree, but I would say you're really a communicator first at this point, as opposed to a researcher. Although I know you're still involved in the science. So I guess I would love to hear from each of you. Here we are at a moment where conventional structures and revenue models of journalism are not really working, and certainly in the book business is also very different than it used to be. And it takes a kind of combination of moxie and creativity to do what you guys have each done. So maybe just talk a little bit about that. Why did you do it, and how did you do it? Just understanding that we don't have I'm sure you could each talk for a really long time about that, but give us a concise version of how you pulled that off, each of you. Helen, you want to go first, maybe?
Sure. I'll be completely honest and say early doors, I could do it by having a very supportive partner. And I'm sure I'm not the only one, possibly, who feels slightly shameful to admit that there were early years when things weren't extraordinarily lucrative for me. And luckily, we were still living student lives, and we pretty much, and we didn't need too much cash, and we traveled a lot and so on. But we figured it out between the two of us. But I think as an individual, I think it would have been, if I was doing that solo, it would have been much trickier. But coming on to the sort of 10, 15 years later, I guess this comes back again to this, what I mentioned earlier, of just doing lots of different things. And for me, that's working really well. I teach, which I kind of see that almost being like the sort of the column, like the regular, the thing I do, but it fits in with everything else. there are the books, there are kids books I'm doing now, and just other things. I guess it's sort of having lots of, I guess in a contrast perhaps to what maybe Ian's experience is, that I've always, well, I've never had a salary for more than 6 months. I've been pretty much freelance pretty much since the, I had short-term projects, but never more than about 6 months at a time, knowing I was going to get a certain amount of money in my bank account. And actually that was freedom for me. Yes, with the supportive partner beside me, not that we've been enormously rich at any point of this, and both of us could be earning more money doing other things. He's also an academic, but more sort of strictly down the line. He has a proper salaried university job. But between us, we figured it out. But yeah, we never got really comfortable with having tons of money. So we're kind of quite happy piecing that together. Not that you should get paid. I mean, you should, and this is a job that should be well paid. And getting to that point where you're actually getting paid what you should be is also a challenge. And then turning down possibly jobs that are less well paid is something you become more brave at, I think, the more you go along down the line. But yeah, so for me, it's a real mixed picture of not relying solely on one source. So when one job drops out, I was writing regularly for National Geographic News, and then that kind of dried up, and I was doing other things as well, so it didn't matter. So I guess that resilience and that kind of inbuilt sort of redundancy, if you like, a little bit within your kind of portfolio of what you're doing is also really helpful to get you through those times when perhaps things aren't going so well in one place or another. But that's my experience of kind of freelance life, I guess.
Ian, you want to tell us the story about why you would do this crazy thing, and what? Tell us about the Outlaw Oceans Project and the kinds of things that you're doing.
Did my wife put you up to this question? No, I mean, so I was at the Times for 17 years. I fell sort of captive to this line of reporting. There were a lot of stories that I didn't get to do for the book. And there were a bunch of things that I kind of wanted to do differently with the stories that at the Times I couldn't do. So I thought, why don't I create a nonprofit, step away, and why don't I try to do some of those things? So the Outlaw Ocean Project is a 501(c)(3) nonprofit. It's sort of, to some degree, akin to ProPublica. It's funded right now largely by philanthropic dollars, but partially by some spin-off projects that monetize the journalism. The things that are different were, number one, let's keep producing kind of tier one polished narrative that we would take and get run in the Washington Post or Nat Geo or the New Yorker, but let's fund it ourselves and therefore maintain control over the intellectual property. So not sell it, give it, much like ProPublica does. We then take the piece. That means I decide the stories and I don't take commission. And I don't have to answer to editors calling up and saying, go do this story. So that was one thing I wanted to get away from. The other thing was we then take the story to the venue. We allow them to run it for X amount of time, a week exclusively, whatever. We then, stage two is take that piece, 5,000, 10,000 word piece, and translate it into 10 languages. And then we've built a grid of about 50, 55 different partners, from big, Der Spiegel, BBC, down to the Taiwan Daily News and Gunjur Online in Gambia. And we then take the piece to them. And again, it's free and translated, and it always has the video and stills. And there's a politics in that, like to try to get readership outside of the echo chamber that is readers of the New Yorker or the New York Times. So stage two is disseminated. That gets a much bigger audience than anything I was ever writing at the New York Times. And then stage three is translate the journalism into something else, sort of give birth to a duck-billed platypus. So, we take the reporting and we convert it into music, podcasts, animation series for Instagram, a mural project, usually sort of hybriding it with art in some fashion. And the goal there is A, to give it longer life, and B, to sort of target, the demographic of readers like my 17-year-old son, who won't read the New York Times and the New Yorker, but he consumes a lot of information. And so sort of accessing him, but globally through alternate platforms. And the music project's one example where we took the sounds of reporting, we team up with musicians, hip hop, classical, electronic, we have them create an album, they hand it back to us, we then publish it with video, etc., and we put it on 50 to 100 platforms, Spotify, Pandora, and the IP traffic is incredible. We have 90 million listeners annually of the music, and a good 20% of those click over from the music to the story, and those are all people that probably wouldn't have read it in Der Spiegel or the New Yorker, and they're all over. And so we do that with music or other things. We have a global mural project and other things, and that's sort of the most fun, frankly, because it's just wild and weird. And the financial component is the streaming revenue that comes from music from the stories goes into the nonprofit. So we don't make profit off of it, but we do make money off of it that comes in and funds more stories. So a story that's coming out next month in the New Yorker costs $130,000 to produce. They'll pay, they're like, look, we insist on paying. So okay, great. If you want to pay, we'll take your money, but you will not own the IP. They put up $10,000 for the story. Again, you'll never close that gap, except and philanthropic dollars are not sustainable, but the trickling revenue of the music helps close that gap and allow us to produce the next story. So that's sort of one of the things that is fun and different in how we handle the journalism.
Wow, that is completely fascinating. I can anticipate two questions from this group listening now. Number one is, can they be contributors? Like whose work are these all stories by you, Ian, or are you interested in collaborators, freelancers? Number one. And number two is, do you think other people can do this? For following their own passions, is it possible or practical, or do you think that this is just kind of a one-off?
So on we have a staff of 10, and right now Joe Sexton, who Dan, is on staff, and he and I largely produce the stories. We are aiming to create an Outlaw Ocean Institute where we'll bring in 5 to 6 fellows a year and sort of work with them. We're probably aiming on young, sort of early career journalists that are outside the US, but we'll probably have one slot for US a year. In terms of steady, I didn't want to be an editor at the Times, and I don't want to be one now. And so we don't tend to take outside stuff. We produce it all internally. We do have a couple of writers on staff, and they produce pieces, but they do 25 other things because they're salaried. So right now we're not taking unsolicited content in that way. But we might start partnering in a year or so when we have the bigger capacity. Scalable. I mean, I think that I do think journalists really can and should start thinking more daringly about collaborations with other types of storytellers. And if you think of a muralist or a musician as a storyteller using a different language, or a photographer or what have you, and sort of working with them, I just think for both of our survival, it's something that really is scalable. Whether the music project per se is something that can be replicated, possibly, for certain stories and certain venues, and but other sorts of melding of journalism with other things for the sake of journalism getting bigger audience and more sustainable, and also for the sake of creating a different type of impact on people. The music, we often say, these stories through music are going through the ear and down to the heart. When I write, it's words that go through the eyes and up to the head. They're affecting people in very different ways. So I just think that part of collaboration is definitely replicatable.
Yeah, wow, that is amazing. So Doug, we have about 10 minutes left. I don't want to, the ball's in your court. However you want to use these last 10 minutes.
Great. There is one thing I wanted, well, there are a couple more things, but I'll limit it. One question that came up in emailing with Ian and Helen. It was actually a question that Helen posed, but so there are a lot of crises on the ocean. One can become depressed reading about it. I guess that I am curious, how important is it to be to have some positivity in the stories? As Helen put it, how do you write stories that are honest yet hopeful? And do people just want to read like stories that are, you know, about problems and things that are kind of interesting and gripping, or is there a place for more sort of hopeful, upbeat stuff, or is there something dishonest about that? This is a question that's not just unique to the ocean, but perhaps is more acute in this case. Maybe Helen, what do you think about that?
I mean, I asked that question because I also want to hear what everyone else thinks about it, because
Sure.
it's something I struggle with and I think about a lot. I don't have a definitive answer to it. I feel my way through it day by day, week by week, year by year. I go through phases. I think when I first started hearing people talking about things like ocean optimism, I think my initial reaction to that was slightly skeptical, that maybe it would be possibly bordering on, I think dishonesty is not the right word, but just, you know, not quite accurately portraying the issues. But at the same time, grappling with the idea of perhaps, you know, exhausted audiences not wanting to hear about yet one more problem. So I don't know. I think I am still, to be honest, I think I am still feeling my way with that. I guess at the heart of it, perhaps what I touched on earlier, which is that, you know, it's not black and white. It's not all good and it's not all bad. There's a whole mixture of things going out there, and how I feel about those issues depends on the day and which way the wind is blowing and what I've just recently read or whatever it might be. So, you know, I think there is definitely space for showing, I guess, again, touching back on this idea of the resilience of the ocean, the recoverability of the ocean, that things can change and for the good, and that good things are happening. I mean, we did a podcast about the Seaspiracy documentary, and a lot of people were kind of concerned that that particular piece of storytelling was leaving out a big part of the story about the picture of sustainable fishing being something that's being done by many different people in different ways. And sure, there are some problems with big label, eco-labeling and that kind of stuff, but it was ignoring that detail of an awful lot of interesting and really inspiring people doing extraordinary things to try and make things better in the ocean. So, you know, I don't think I haven't answered this question for myself very well, but I guess maybe the honesty I can bring to it is that I'm still feeling my way on it. And it's story by story for me. I mean, I often work from the kind of position of that sense of wonderment in the ocean. I mean, if you have a look at The Brilliant Abyss, you'll see basically it's like first half wonderment, second half everything's terrible, final chapter, here's what we do about it. So it's not rocket science. But hopefully it's working to some extent to sort of balance that out, but maybe in a slightly chunkier way than you would, you know, get if you were just writing an article. But yeah, so I mean, I'd love to hear anyone else's thoughts on that, to be honest. Doug, you as well. I mean, this is your beat too, right? I mean, how do we do this? I think it's something that's going to become increasingly important, you know, as the years go by. Come back to me in the middle of November after we've had the COP meeting and see how I'm feeling then. I mean, I may decide everything is bad after all. I don't know.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, Ian.
You know, I vacillate, honestly. If on the one hand, I'm strongly of the view that the very problems that I try to focus on are not ones that I'm seeing overly focused on. They're usually like woefully undercovered. And it's a lack of attention, a lack of sense of urgency, a lack of a concern by the relevant parties that I see as the bigger worry I have. On the other hand, I think Helen and you make a really accurate point that there is exhaustion and a morale concern among the public writ large, especially post-pandemic, post-apocalyptic, you know, American crisis, post so many things that you do wonder whether you're worsening that problem while you're tackling another problem. So at the end of the day, when I step back and look at generally the coverage that's out there of this space, I see sort of more awe than awful, you know, in Nat Geo sort of terms. Like I see a lot of awe and reporting, which I think is really good. I don't see as much investigative kind of reporting on categories of concern out there. Um, so when I look at that space specifically, I feel like it's still in dire need of more explanatory investigative reveal of issues. The one thing I would say that maybe is middle ground between both responsibilities is the notion that if you're going to do good journalism, and I don't think that Seaspiracy is good journalism. I don't think that that does this well. If you're going to do really good journalism about serious problems, then in the very revealing of them, you need to have a sense of nuance and an explanatory element that shows a path for solving it. You can't just like splash the problem and have no attempt or responsibility for showing some sort of, I don't think personally journalists should necessarily have a, here's what you should do, a buyer's guide for fixing this. I'm not of that belief, but I think like in how you explain problems, you probably should try to think about what might be the fixes. And then you leave it to the advocates or the academics or the policymakers or the lawyers or who have you to then say, okay, we're going to act on this journalism and do something about it. I feel like that is very, very important for investigative journalists. But I think there's, I still personally believe there's a real lack of prosecutorial, investigative, responsible, good reporting of dark stuff happening out there.
Just one follow-up that while we still have time, Ian, you've done a lot of things. I mean, you have a passion for investigative journalism. You've been in a lot of places in the ocean specifically, or reporting on piracy in Somalia, where it genuinely seems like you were at risk of serious injury or death. And I wonder if what is it that motivates you to keep going and in experiencing things like that, has a thought occurred that like, this is just too risky, I need to stop or whatever? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I don't have a good answer. I mean, my answer, if I'm really honest, is, Catholic guilt. I know, yeah, I'm a fallen away Catholic, I'm an atheist, but like, I think if I really assessed myself, I'd say like, what keeps me going is the more I'm exposed, the more I feel obligated to do something about it in my small way, which is journalism. And to walk away from it is a disservice to the very things I've witnessed. And I can't imagine doing so. So I feel a bit trapped by the sense of duty to try to do right by the problems that I'm witnessing. And the one way I can do that, sometimes I wonder, is it enough? Should I jump ship from journalism and jump full into something else? Yeah, I'm haunted by that question, but I never consider leaving it. It doesn't, because honestly, I think I would be more haunted. The prospect of the sense that I know this stuff is happening and I'm not doing a whole lot about it, scares me more than the people on these boats, frankly. So I think that's really why I keep going.
Well, that's a wonderfully inspirational way to end. I think that this is hard work, whether you're doing explanatory work or investigative work. It is hard to write about these issues because they're bleak in many ways, and it's our responsibility. Our first responsibility is to depict reality as closely as we can. That's what we do, and that's hard. The other day I was hanging out with some of my friends here in the suburbs, and one of them was talking about National Geographic and saying, I used to really love National Geographic, but now there are all these stories about everything's falling apart. And I'm like, yes, because a lot of things are falling apart. And in the end, even when it's hard, and even when it's uncomfortable for us personally and uncomfortable for the people who read us, we have that obligation. But it's always smart to blend it with other kinds of stories too, both for our own mental health and for our readers too, because the world has happy news in it too, and it's important to give people that. Very grateful to all of you guys. Very grateful to Helen and Ian, and to our audience who stuck with us. And to Doug, especially for organizing this and asking such good questions. This will be available online in a few days at journalism.nyu.edu/KC, and follow that same space, because we will have additional events coming up, both sad and happy, because that's the way our world is. So thank you all very much, and we'll see you online next time. Thank you, guys.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so